Okay, so as a review, we're going to open this in the browser, and we've got our home page kind of almost set. We did the gradient, we added some text, and we added all of these buttons. If you recall, there was really nothing new about the button part except for just using images. But we did the same thing we did in our buttons example where we created one button, set up all of its over and down states, and then we duplicated that symbol to create each of the other ones. Besides learning how the gradients work just within the color panel up here, and then also that that gradient transform tool that we had to kind of find from over here. In fact, I'm going to drag it back onto that. I don't know why it didn't save. We'll need to use it again, but let's see. So yes, we did the gradients, the free transform tool, the text field. We also use the align panel, which I use quite a bit. This icon over here, or no, I'm sorry, this one right here, where we did align to stage, and then we also unchecked align to stage and aligned these buttons and made them the same amount, the same space from each other in different ways. So that was all stuff we did to get started. And now we have, the first thing I want to do is I want to change a couple of publishing options, okay? Because when we look at this in our browser, right now it's just stuck up in the left-hand corner. And that's the way it is by default, and it's usually not what we want. I want to show you what the different options are that we can set to like center this and have it scale at different sizes and stuff, right? So inside of Animate, I want you to go over here, look at your properties panel, and make sure that you click, just nothing should be selected. I've got all of my layers locked. My buttons, my title, my background layer are all locked. I can see under Publish Settings, I can see this More Settings button. All right, and that'll open up this Publish Settings dialog box, okay? And you can see that it shows Publish JavaScript /HTML. That's what we should be on. We don't need to export these other formats. We don't need to worry about that at all in this class. But inside of this JavaScript HTML format, there's a couple of options that we can play with and set to just make our movie display a little bit differently on the page. All right. So starting off, inside of this JavaScript HTML area, there's 3 different tabs at the top: Basic, HTML/JS, and Image Settings. So they're kind of funny to see because they're just text-based. But we're going to start off on the Basic tab right here. So open this up, and loop timeline, include hidden layers. I've never touched those in 20 years of using this program. Those are just the defaults. That's fine. But these next 3 checkboxes are all things that we want to be aware of. Everything else, the stuff that's already checked, the export image assets, all this stuff for now, we can leave defaults. But right now we want to pay attention to these 3 unchecked ones. So first one is center stage. All right, I'm going to check center stage and then see that the drop down gives me an option of either horizontally, vertically, or both. So I can check these, and it pretty much does what you would expect, that if I check center stage and choose horizontally, then I test it in my browser again, Command return or Control enter. Whoops, I actually have to close it first and hit OK. And hit OK, and then publish my movie to the browser, Command return. And sure enough, it is now centered horizontally on the screen. And if I were to take my browser window and kind of change sizes, it moves along and stays centered. All right, this is important when we know that we're not really sure what kind of screen the end user is going to be looking at our stuff on. It could be a big full screen laptop, could be a tablet, a phone. So because of that, we want this to be responsive in some way to different screen sizes. So now I'm going to go back into the More Settings here again. And I'm just going to keep opening that dialog box and changing something and then hitting OK and publishing just to see all these different options. So kind of get used to doing that. You can kind of follow along with my screen and just kind of watch and switch back and try a little bit here and there with yours. But we're going to try a few of the options, and at the end, I'll kind of show you which ones I want you to have set. Okay. So horizontally, if I change it to vertically, hit OK, publish it. Okay, now it's like this on the vertical side. Now, why would I want to choose one or the other? I don't know. There could be situations, especially when we talk about the background around it. I'll talk about that in a moment. Usually, and the way I want you to set it, so I guess for this one, you can just set this one right now on your own, is under center stage, just keep it at both. All right, so select center stage, make both, hit OK, and then you can publish your movie again. And now instead of being stuck up in the upper left corner, it is now centered to the stage. And the way this works is that HTML file that is being generated along with the JavaScript file. So the JavaScript file is holding all the stuff that we are creating in Animate, all the objects that we put on these timelines, all the code we write, all of that just gets transformed into this single JavaScript file that we never really need to look at. And then we also never really need to look at this HTML file. There's one exception, we talk about the background. But just knowing that this HTML file is holding our little Canvas movie and displaying it through that. And if I just peek at the code of this HTML file, once I set that dialog box to center, this opens for me. Now all of a sudden, it actually adds some CSS type code into our index file automatically for us that centers the movie. All right, so these files that automatically generate, they do change depending on what you have selected and what you're doing, but it's really cool. That's why we use Animate, so we don't have to code anything but like the simple buttons, and the rest of it gets kind of handled automatically for us. So that's the centering. We want to keep that. Now the next one, make responsive. Now this is interesting. Both by height and by width, and then there's like an extra box under it, scale to fill visible area. Now if I go back to my browser screen, and before I've done anything to click make responsive, okay, this is centered, but now if I take my browser screen and I make it smaller, and I make it so small that it's like smaller than the movie, than the canvas, nothing happens to the canvas, it just gets cut off like this, and it just scrolls. All right, this is what a default website would do, right? If you get too small, it just gives you these scroll bars. But if I were looking at this on like a phone, for example, which later on I'll show you guys how you can kind of mimic what it looks like on different phones and different screen sizes and stuff inside of the Chrome browser, but we won't worry about that yet. Just for different browser sizes, now if we change this and check this check mark, make responsive, and leave that at both. Now if I hit OK, publish it to the browser again. All right, every time I publish to the browser, it opens a new tab also, so I end up with all these tabs. Later on, when we're doing a little code debugging, I'll show you guys how to just leave the same tab open. But for right now, this is the easiest way. So now that it's still centered, but now that I have make responsive on both the vertical and horizontal, now if I make my screen size smaller, now it actually gets smaller and fits the screen. See that? Whether horizontally or vertically, whichever way it needs to scale to continue to fit, it does that automatically. And so that's also something that we're going to want to have set in your projects, so that if someone looks at something, now this size, again, this 960 by 540 should be pretty close to looking good on most like tablets and modern smartphones and stuff. But on larger screens, so stay centered, or anything that may even be smaller than that, it's now going to scale appropriately and just letterbox where it needs to. Letterboxing is the term, kind of a video term that refers to just the space that is around the actual content window. So we get some side letterboxing here if the screen is too wide, or some top letterboxing. Maybe if someone's looking at it at a phone that might be like this aspect ratio, then it's going to kind of just be a little strip in the middle and have some edging around the sides. All right, so let's make sure that inside of the more settings, we basically have these first two settings checked. All right, and then the next one, I'm going to show you what it does, but we're going to kind of leave it by the default for ours. Depending on your project, you might want to adjust it. But if we select scale to fill visible area, okay, there is fit in view or stretch to fit. Now, what this is going to do, we'll start with fit in view, is this is going to, when the window is actually larger than our canvas size and our movie size, then it's going to actually scale it up, which if we have vectors, that's fine, but if we have images, that's usually not ideal. I'll show you what I mean. So we're going to leave it with just the default scale to fill invisible area. And I will hit, whoops, I didn't need to hit publish, I just need to hit OK. And now I'm going to publish it like this, Command return on the keyboard to publish it to the browser. Okay, and boom, now you can see that these bodacious bunnies are right up in my face. And it doesn't matter, now it's still responsive, and it will still letterbox, okay, depending on where it needs to go, but it will actually scale up bigger than its original size. Now, this isn't too big of a deal right now, and I will let you guys, for your own projects, decide whether you want it to scale up or not like this. If you have all vector art in your project, then you should probably scale it up, or at least you can, because the vector stuff is never going to pixelate. It's always just going to fix and look nice and crisp and clear. But the images, if you start scaling images up too high, like these aren't too bad because they're smaller on the screen, you can't see too much pixelation. But if I had like a big background image that was the whole thing, and I started getting it like scaled too high, or even on someone that has like a 4K monitor, it would look really bad. So a lot of times you want to just not let something scale any larger than your intended original size and just have it scaled down to smaller screens. But it kind of depends on what your content is and what your project is. So probably when we do our first initial review of when you start to get your actual graphics in your project and you start looking at things put together, we can kind of individually, a project at a time, decide what looks best, either scaling or not scaling. So that being said, I'm going to show you the other option here, the fit in view versus stretch to fit. Now with fit in view, one I was just looking at, like I said, it's still going to letterbox around the edges. And that makes it so all of the content is always seen, all right? It's never cut off in any way. But the other way, if we decide stretch to fit, hit OK, publish stretch to fit. Okay, now I'm never going to have any letterboxing. Now, if my aspect ratio is close to what my original size was, it's going to look pretty good and it's going to fill it all up. But as I can see, if I start to scale things down, it's actually going to cut off my content. So if I were to look at this on a phone and it was more like, or a tablet that was more like this size, I can't even see my titles cut off. I can't even see two of my buttons. All right, so it really depends on what type of application you have and what you're trying to do. Sometimes not, having anything around it is nice, and you can kind of design it centered so, parts of the background can be cut off. But in our case, this is not so good. We're not going to want this. We're always going to want all of our content, no matter what type of project you have. We're not going to want that to cut off. So I'm going to go back to Animate here, and finally, I'm going to leave make responsive, but for this project, I'm just going to uncheck scale to fit visible area. I don't want that on at all because I just want it to stay at the original size. If it's too big, and then later on, I'm going to show you guys we can actually add a little bit of CSS style code to the HTML file. We'll do this a bit later in this example, but I'll show you how we can actually change the background. Now, inside of Animate, we can't change anything besides what's in this box, but we can open the HTML file separately, and we can add a little bit of code to put either a solid color behind this, just to make it fit a little better instead of just on white, or you can even use an image. And put an image behind it, and put an image that may look like it fits your project a little bit better. So then the last setting here, or I guess there's two more I want to touch, but under more settings, the last one of this little center group here, we've got center stage both, we've got make responsive both, And now we've got the include preloader. I want all of you to definitely click on include preloader. All right, and what this does is this will actually this will put an animated GIF, just a little looping animation, right in the middle of the screen until all your graphics are loaded, and then it'll disappear and your graphics will show up, right? And this does some magic behind the scenes in your HTML file to kind of set all that up. So what's cool is I can click on preview here. See that there's a drop down for default or browse, and I can click on preview to show me what the default loader looks like. So it opened this little preview menu and it's showing this little box. It's not even showing it animated. I guess I can scroll down and see the frames, but it's just this blue square, just kind of goes around clockwise. That's the default one that it comes with, and I want everyone in your projects to at least have this turned on. So from where we started, we really just select center stage, leave it on both, select make responsive, leave it on both, leave scale to fit visible area unselected, and then select include preloader. Now that we have include preloader selected, I'm gonna hit OK. I'm gonna run my thing again, and I might be able to see it. Okay, I saw it for just a split second. If I hit refresh, you can see that little box show up, and that's because we're working locally and there's nothing to download, so I can just see it for a hair. But once we put these things up actually on the internet, which we're going to do in this class with your projects, probably about the halfway point review, we'll put things up online so you can see how the download's looking, but that'll sit there for a couple of seconds. Now I'll review this next part again with you guys later, but you can actually, which is kind of fun to play with, you can make your own preloader. Okay, so instead of just leaving it default to leave that little box, which will work automatically, and that's good enough, you can just choose browse, and you can go choose your own animated GIF that you have saved on your computer, or you can go to like Google for loading GIFs. Loading.io, that's the one I was thinking of. So there are like multiple websites that are dedicated to having like a ton of these different little loading icons that you could download, just little animated GIFs that you could use in place. Let's see. Preloaders, icons 8. So yeah, just a ton of little preloader elements that you could download one of these to your computer somewhere and then just connect to it, or you could make your own little animated GIF. All right, so pretty cool. So for right now, we're just going to leave the default one that shows up ever so slightly. And then there's one final thing that I want to do in here, right? So far, all we've really done is just checked and left the default of these 3 check marks, all right? So make sure you have these center stage both, make responsive both, include preloader default, make sure the scale of fit visible area is not checked. The next one is this export image assets, all right? This is something that Animate keeps changing as far as what they want the default to be. And there's 3 different types: texture, spreadsheet, sprite sheet, and image assets. What this means is it's asking what it wants you to do with all of these images and stuff when it actually publishes and creates this images folder. All right, so right now in my images folder, what it's doing, first of all, it added that preloader GIF, which we can see. So it creates that image and puts it in there for us. And then it's got, by default, this website atlas1 PNG. It's creating this image that's got all 4 of my images on it, plus it's even got the title on it, which is kind of interesting because this title is a graphic. This is text that we created inside of Animate. All right, so what's happening is, by default, this export as texture, what that does is that will take every single image and then any of what it considers to be a complicated vector shape, and it will create images for you, and it will put them all on one big image, And in some cases, in a lot of cases, that can be helpful because that can make things load a little faster. You can even make things run a little faster, depending on how complicated your vector shapes are and stuff if you're doing some pretty heavy animation. But I've learned that that and the sprite sheet method, which the sprite sheet method pretty much does half of that. The sprite sheet method will take every image that you have and add it all to one big image in the exact same way texture does, only the sprite sheet method won't mess with your vectors at all. It'll just leave all your vectors vectors. Texture tries to take complicated vectors and make images out of them. Again, both of these, sprite sheet and texture, are kind of an advanced setting that makes it supposedly work a little faster in certain situations on mobile devices if you're building something really complicated. But I have found over and over again that these two settings can cause more problems than not. So I want everyone to set this to image assets, all right? And what this does is this simply tells it, don't do anything to my vector shapes, leave them all vector because I want to be able to scale them and just use them default as they are. And don't mess with any of my images into these other giant images either, just leave them as individual images and lay them out in a folder for me. All right, so this export image asset should have already been checked. All we're doing is just switching it from texture down to image assets. I'm actually going to show you what happens when we do that and I publish my movie. So one last time, because this is the end of what we'll need for today anyway, inside of our publish settings here. So again, just check center stage both, check make responsive both, uncheck scale to fill visible area, check include preloader for the default preloader, and then under export image assets, which should also be checked, you want to change it to image assets. I'm going to show you what happens. I'm going to hit OK. I'm also going to save, or file save, or Command S, save all of my settings here. Now I'm going to go over to my Finder where my website folder is. All right, and this images folder, which has the preloader and this website atlas that it created with my old settings, this will actually stay in there unless I delete it. So because I know I changed my settings, I'm actually going to delete my entire images folder. I don't have to, but I could if I wanted, delete my HTML, my JavaScript file too, because as soon as I publish, these two are going to be overwritten every time with the new stuff. And then that images folder is going to be created. So I'll just leave those here, even though they're going to be overwritten. But now, when I go to publish my file, hit Command Return to open it in the browser, and it publishes it and opens it. All right, I can see it's centered, it's responsive, and I can refresh and see the loading icon ever so slightly for a moment. If I hold Shift and hit refresh, that should make it load as much as it needs to. All right, so now if I go back and peek at my Finder and look at my images folder, now instead of having that one atlas file, it still has the preloader GIF that added in there. And now, though, it has my 4 separate bunny images that were named and all scaled appropriately, and I pulled out of the Photoshop file. So see, it just created these separate images now in the images folder for it to pull in and use in the application. And that's important because, like I said, I've seen issues with the texture and the sprite sheet kind of image exporting, with sometimes images just not showing up right, or sometimes even not showing up at all. And I found that pretty much 100% of the time, setting it as individual images like this makes everything work right. So I'm doing this in such a way as you might start your own project, right? Where, okay, now you've got these published settings, you probably start there. Where I talked about before, you'll create a folder for your project, you'll create an assets folder for your project and put all your final graphics and stuff in there that you're currently working on. And then you'll, open up a new animate file and you'll save it in there. When you open that up, probably the first thing I would do is go in and just make those settings accordingly, so you're all good to go with your settings, no matter what you put in there. And then you'll probably start bringing in your graphics to make your first page, like a splash page or a begin page or something like that, which We may go back and add to this. We probably will, but for right now, this is our home page with our title and our 4 buttons like this. And for right now, this is all we want on this page. At this point now, we want to make our buttons work and go to some other pages. The idea is I actually want a 5-page site to start off. This is our one home page. And then we're going to go in and make a separate page for each of these little bunnies. So that when we click this button, it'll go to that page. All right. Now, I'm talking this out loud because this next step is a pretty important step that I want you to think through in your own project. All right. So far, I've showed you how to create some different layers for you to put your different objects on. Whatever kind of graphics, backgrounds, titles, buttons, whatever you have on your first page. You should kind of be able to follow this to import things, whether you're importing images or drawing graphics, you know, just put stuff on screen, organize them, make graphic symbols out of things you think you might animate, make button symbols out of things that are buttons. You can set up the button states like we have. But now, before it's time to actually put code on these buttons, we need to set up the rest of our timeline. We need to set up what pages we're going to have. All right, now we did this in a similar way when we actually did our buttons example with our grow, flip, and shrink little character. Before we ever created the buttons and before we ever put any code on any of the buttons, the first thing we did was we had to set up our timeline and put the 3 animations on our timeline so we could take our cursor here and just drag across and see them all. So even if we're not just doing animations, even if we're doing entire separate pages, entire separate screens, we still need to just lay out the timeline and create those frame labels to kind of tell us where these places are. All right. Now this is what we're going to do with this project, but I want you to kind of think about how you might do this in your own project. It's really easy to just import a Photoshop file and all of a sudden have a page here. But then it's like, okay, what do I do next? And the next step after you just kind of get some stuff in for your first page is always to just lay out your timeline and create some frame labels for what other pages and other sections that you need to set up. Okay, so the first thing that we'll always do is actually give ourselves some time to work with here. So as if we were going to create an animation, we're not going to create an animation, we're just going to create different pages and different spots of the timeline. But right now we can't because we're stuck on frame 1, okay? So the first thing we need to do is go in and I'm going to go out to frame 100. It doesn't have to be exactly like mine, but I'm going to give myself just, this happens to be what I can see on my screen. It's a nice round number, and it just gives me some time to work with. All right, so I am going to select all 3 of these layers at frame 100. I'm just clicking in the first keyframe and just dragging down to make that selection, turns blue. Select all 3, and I'm going to add frames. Hotkey, F5, that's what I use. That's what I would recommend everyone use because it's much faster. F5 to add frames. But if you are not using the hotkey, then I think the second fact that you can either right click and choose insert frames, or you can use this little, oops, not this one, this little icon here to insert frame. All right, but like I said, I'd highly recommend that you use these function keys. Whoops, I accidentally just added keyframes because it's much, much faster as you go about and start working in this program. So I used F5 to create these frames, so now I can move around. All right, I can move around, but besides just adding frames, the other big part is to add a layer where we can put our frame labels at the very top. So I want you to add a layer above the buttons layer, this little plus icon right here, and then double click the layer name and change it to code. If you remember from our buttons example, we did this same thing, and I explained that we'll always have a layer at the top named code so that we can put our code on those keyframes and easily keep track of them. But we're also going to put frame labels on this layer. So we always have these labels going across the timeline telling us you know, what spots represent different spots in the timeline so we can ultimately tell our buttons to go to those different places. All right, so we used F5 to just add some frames out to frame 100 or thereabouts. Just give yourself some time to actually work with. And then we made a code layer. And now we want to actually add some keyframes and some frame labels on this code layer to define what different pages we're going to set up. So again, this is the step that you'll kind of have to think through and can probably use your content map to determine, like, okay, what are my main sections? What are my main screens? How many of these different kind of pages do I need to lay out across the timeline? The first one, we already have a keyframe on frame 1, and this is where our home page is going to stay. So we're just going to label this one home. So I'm going to select this empty keyframe on frame 1 of the code layer, go over here to the label name input box in the properties panel, and we're going to use all lowercase. It's really important to keep things lowercase when we're writing frame labels so that when we reference them later in the code with the buttons, it's much easier to not make a mistake and not have to think about capital letters. So all lowercase home, we'll type that in there and hit return. And then poof, it opens up, or it creates this little red flag with the word home right there, and that's our frame label. Remember, we can reference these in our button code to tell our button code to jump places. So later on, when we get to one of these pages, we'll have like a back button or a home button or something, and we'll be able to tell it to go to this little home label. All right, so we know we have a home page. Now the rest of it, this is what you'll have to figure out in your own project. But for this project, I just know that we're going to want to create a separate page for each of these bunnies, right? So I'm personally going to put mine, doesn't really matter how far apart they are on the timeline because it's not linear. We're just going to jump to them in different ways. But for right now, I'm going to separate mine by every half second on the timeline. So every 15 frames. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create 4 new keyframes. So I've got my home page, and I want 4 new pages. I'm going to create 4 new keyframes, 15 frames apart. So I'm going to use F6 to create a keyframe on 15, 30, 45, and 60. You can kind of see the 1 second and 2 second markers here on the timeline. And now, and again, F6, what I'd highly recommend you use, F6 creates keyframes, Shift F6 removes keyframes. If you have to, go up into your system preferences, and under keyboard, you can find the right settings depending on your type of computer. If you're on a PC, your function keys probably already work. If you're on a Mac, you may need to check this, use F1, F2, etc. keys, or they may be a drop-down. If you have a kind of Mac with a little touchpad up top there for the function keys, you may need to find the right drop-down thing to tell them to show. Again, sorry if I'm repeating this a lot, but I have worked in this program in the trenches and agencies and cubicles for years and years and years, and I can't stress enough how much faster it is to work with hotkeys in any program than it is just to click everything with your mouse. So if you're serious about being a professional in this field, I'd highly recommend that you start to cultivate that and just try and use a handful, like 5 or 6 different hotkeys in each program, and you might find yourself working a lot faster once you get used to that. So anyway, F6, Shift F6, we made these keyframes, okay? Now on these keyframes, I want to put labels, and like I explained before, when you're making labels and coding things, it's helpful to keep things generic rather than to name them specifically to your contents. What I mean by that is I know these are going to be 4 different pages, but instead of naming it like Bunny 1, Bunny 2, Bunny 3, and Bunny 4, I'm going to name them Page 1 through Page 4, so that if I were to ever use this project again, I don't have to rename bunnies and change it to whatever my content is. I can just leave it as generic page. And that's helped me in my career be able to reuse projects and not always have to start from scratch and recreate the wheel every time. And for a while, I was just, whenever I reuse something, I was changing a million things I didn't have to change just to make it make sense. So anyway, let's label these keyframes here. Frame 15 on the code layer, I'm going to label this keyframe Page 1. all lowercase, no spaces, just page 1. I'm going to do the same thing on the other ones and name them page 2 through page 4. Each time I'm just typing it in the frame label in the properties panel when I have that keyframe selected, and then I'm hitting return, which kind of lets it take and gives me these frame labels. All right, so later on we may add another page or two, we may add a video page or something else. But for right now, these 5 pages are good for us to start. I'm going to save my project. On the timeline, there's these 3 layers. And the lighter gray versus the darker gray is denoting having an actual object on that layer. So if I were to create new layers, you can see they start off as dark gray, and it really has to do with the keyframe, right? So an empty keyframe is an empty circle right here. And if I were to just draw something like a circle on this layer, okay, now all of a sudden that keyframe becomes darkened, turns black, and now all of a sudden the entire layer is this lighter gray color, kind of showing me that there's something in it. So you can think of the darker gray as being empty, like the empty circle, and then the lighter gray is being filled with something. So if I were to, for example, put a keyframe here and then delete it, now all of a sudden this layer is light gray only where that circle exists, and then when I put a keyframe and deleted it, it turns dark gray. Okay, so that gray shading is just kind of a visual cue as to whether there's actual objects on that timeline or on that layer. And our code layer right now is the only one that doesn't really have objects on it. Even though we're putting keyframes and labels on them, we don't really have anything visible on the screen for that. All right, one other thing that's interesting that's kind of new with the layers is there's this new little dot over here that we can now kind of tell the layer to have a color go all the way across so we can help keep track of what's on what. So there's now 4 different kind of layer tools here. Locking is pretty self-explanatory, where you can either select what's on the layer or you can't. Right now I have my buttons layers locked, so I can't select anything. There's the visibility, the little eyeball that lets you hide and show layers. Both of those are pretty self-explanatory. But then there's like the color box, which is the outlines. You can switch a layer to be just the outlines, which sometimes can be helpful if you have a bunch of layers and you're trying to see what's what. And then finally, what I was just talking about, there's now this little, I think this was new in 2020, there's this little color circle right here that if you click, the layer will actually light up a little bit, it'll shade in a color, and then it'll project that color in a line all the way down it. And that could be helpful if you have a whole bunch of layers and you're way down here on the timeline and you're trying to kind of, keep track of which layer you're on. That kind of color visual cue can be helpful. Little tools that can help out. I'm going to turn all mine off, so I don't want to confuse the issue, but I may highlight things here and there based on that. All right, so that's kind of that first step here, is we have all these different spots. So now in theory, we could take our timeline and we could kind of go from page to page, okay? Now the next step, once we decide what we're gonna make, is to just actually, through layers and keyframes and importing, is to actually put stuff on these pages and change what's on the timeline, okay? So first off, the first thing we want to do is our buttons layer. I want the buttons to only be on the home page, okay? I can leave the title for now. We can leave the background. It's going to stay there across all the pages. But the buttons I want to disappear as soon as I get to any of these pages. Now, I don't know which one the user is going to choose to go to first. We're eventually going to make these buttons work. So we click them and they jump to these pages. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that the buttons just aren't there. And the way you make things appear and disappear is just through keyframes. You either add something to a keyframe or you delete it from a keyframe. Now in this case, I'm going to unlock my buttons layer. I'm even going to highlight my buttons layer by clicking that little circle there. I can see the green line going all the way down it. and I'm going to put a keyframe on page 1 because whatever I put on this keyframe is just going to project all the way across the rest of the timeline, across all of the pages. So if I put a keyframe here, F6, and then I'm going to delete all of my buttons. Now, as soon as I hit the keyframe, they're already all selected. If I clicked away from it, I'd have to kind of shift select all my buttons again. But I'm going to delete them from that keyframe. So now I can see that the keyframe changes its visual cue. It has buttons on it with this filled in black circle. It's got that light gray. And then as soon as I hit page 1, all of a sudden I put a keyframe that's now empty because I deleted everything on it. But it remembers that, right? So I can see, so when I'm on the home page, from here on out, when I say like, go to the home page or go to page 1 or go to page 2, what I mean by that is I mean, take your little blue playhead here and just drag it to that label. And that's what we're gonna do after our break here. We're gonna take a break in a minute, is we're gonna actually put in another layer, and we're gonna put in some more graphics on keyframes at these specific pages to make what's on this timeline change as we go across it. Before we ever code any buttons at all, we'll wanna be able to just drag our playhead and kind of see the different pages we're going to want to go to when we program our buttons. All right, so that's our first step here, is basically just laying out our graphics. So if you imagine, you know, we've only really designed this once, but if you imagine, you know, designing 5 different pages in a Photoshop file, then, you know, we've imported our first page, got it all set up here. Now we've created places on the timeline for each of our other pages, and we're going to import our graphics at these spots and make it so we can just drag across and see all of our graphics show up at different times. Let's put a new layer. Let's put it just above background. Let's make a new layer and call it pages. And now this is a big empty layer that has nothing on the home page and nothing all the way across it. And we're going to end up starting with putting a keyframe on page 1, on the pages layer. So take your playhead and go to where your page 1 label is. And mine's on frame 15, just wherever your page label is. And then I'm going to make a keyframe with F6 on the pages layer. So now we've got actually 3 different keyframes on page 1. One of them is on the actual code layer that has the label, page 1. One of them is on the buttons layer, which is empty because we deleted what was in there. That's what makes the buttons disappear. And then they stay disappeared across the other pages because this keyframe just kind of persists to the right. It's important to realize. And then finally, this pages layer, we have nothing on it yet, but we do have a keyframe ready to start putting stuff on. So I want you to save your website. Let's carry on. All right, now we actually want to, I'm gonna unhighlight my buttons layer here. In fact, I'm gonna highlight my pages layer, which happens to give me this pink color now. We'll just start with bringing in the image, and then I'll do the title a little differently. Okay, so on this keyframe, on the pages layer, what I wanna do is I wanna pull in the image for that particular bunny. So our first bunny, bunny 1 here, sitting on the rocks. Make sure I'm on the pages layer. I'm going to select that empty keyframe that we made on page 1. And then I'm just going to drag bunny 1 in from the timeline. Okay, and I want it at its full size here. This is the nice 400 by 400. All right, now I am going to use the align panel, which is this little icon with the line to the left of the 2 rectangles. And I'm going to leave align to stage checked, and I'm going to just basically align this to the very center by clicking these 2 little center buttons up here. And that gets me started, but then I can see it's up in the middle of my title. So from the very center, I'm actually going to nudge this down a little bit. I'm going to hold shift and use the arrow keys. You can just drag it down a little if you want, but I'm usually a little more precise. I nudged it down 40 pixels there by hitting the arrow key 4 times, holding shift. So now it's nice and centered horizontally, and then it's got a nice padding on both the top and the bottom here. All right. Now, the next thing I want to do is so I've got my title in place. This is taking the place of my page for right now, or my image, but I want to actually change the title. Okay, this is going to be a little interesting. We're going to do a couple funky things here. Close my align panel. I want to change the title. So to change it, always we want a keyframe. So I'm going to actually unlock my title layer. In fact, the only layer that's locked now is my background layer. On my title layer, I want to put a keyframe right here on page 1 also. And again, when I say on page 1, I just mean in the same vertical position as the page 1 label, right? So on the title layer, I'm going to hit F6 to create a keyframe for my title as well. And now, so I've got these 2 layers representing this page now. I've got an image and I've got the title, and I want to actually change the title. So I'm going to double click and go into it. Now we want to name this little bunny. So I'm going to change this now to make sure that my text stays centered. Before I actually change it, I'm going to go look at the paragraph settings over here. So I'm selecting all the text, and I can see the paragraph settings over in the object properties panel. And mine's already set to centered, but if yours is set to left or right justify or something, you might want to set it to centered, or you can just center it afterwards, but kind of saves a step. I do this a lot when I'm editing text, is make sure I have it justified the way I want it before I edit it. So this is Marvin. Perfect. So go ahead and name Marvin there. Now we are going to end up creating similar pages with different images and titles and things. But before that, we're going to do something similar to what we did with the buttons, where we're going to set up a symbol for our page, and then we're just going to duplicate it to use it as the starting point for the other pages. We don't have to set everything up from scratch. So we're going to create the 3rd type of symbol. So far, we created graphic symbols, which is the base symbol that you want to use when you're animating something. Whenever you're making tweens to animate something, you definitely want things to be a symbol, whether it's a graphic or a button, or the 3rd type that we're going to do in a moment, a movie clip. You can animate any of those, but if you're just animating, you at least need it to be a graphic symbol. The button symbols, as you guys have seen, work a little bit differently than graphic symbols. You can still animate them if you want it in the same way, but inside of them, instead of there being a timeline, there is the button states that you can change with the different keyframes, right? And then we can actually attach code to the button instance name and make those work. Now, the 3rd type of symbol is called a movie clip. All right, a movie clip works a lot like a graphic symbol in the sense that when you go inside to edit it, there's just a timeline, just like a graphic symbol is. But there's a couple of key differences to a movie clip. The biggest one is that we're able to give a movie clip an instance name and talk to it in code, just like we can with a button. So movie clips are usually used as like containers of things, ways to like group things together. If you've worked a lot in Illustrator, you can think of a movie clip as the best way to kind of group symbols and put symbols inside of symbols if you're doing more than just animation. If you're just doing straightforward animation, you can just nest graphic symbols and you can use just mostly graphic symbols. But as soon as you get into interactive and start using buttons, it's better to group things together using movie clip symbols, because you'll have a little more fine-grained control over them when you start coding. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to combine, because a movie clip symbol is usually a container for other things, we're going to actually combine both the title and the image into a single symbol, into a movie clip. Now, what's going to happen, you can kind of watch mine first, and then and then you can do it on your own. But what's going to happen is, because right now these are on 2 different layers, as soon as I create a symbol, it's going to just put it on one of the 2 layers. And I think it's actually going to put it on the title layer. And then we're going to need to move it down to the pages layer and then re-keyframe the title away. It's going to be kind of complicated, but I just want you to really look close and see what's happening here, because once you start to learn how you can group things from multiple layers into a single symbol, and then kind of get those layers back inside of that symbol, that's a pretty major step for your brain to be able to take to start organizing things inside of this. All right, so we've got our main timeline where we're going to have our main home page and then each of our individual pages. But right now we're going to set up a symbol for our one home page, or our page one, where we can have, you know, its own set of timeline and layers for that page. So go ahead now, you can watch me first, you can do it at the same time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select both items. I'm going to select both the title and the image, both on page one and this pages thing. You can see both of the keyframes are selected. It even selects all the way down the layer. And when I have both of them selected, I held shift to do that selection. So I just click to select one. Again, I'm on the selection tool, holding shift to select the other one. Once I have them both selected, now I can choose convert to symbol. I'm going to use F8 because it's fastest, but you can use the convert to symbol little icon here. You can right click, convert to symbol, all those other methods. Now you get the same convert to symbol dialog box that we've seen to create graphics and buttons. Now this time we want to make sure that it's a movie clip symbol, okay? Excuse me. So with this movie clip symbol, I also want to make sure the registration's in the center. Sometimes it can be up in the upper left. In this case, I do want it to be centered. I'm just going to keep that centered. And I'm going to give it a name. And I'm going to name this symbol page one. All right, the same name that I named the frame label. Hit OK. And now it combined both of these into the same symbol. Now, if you look at the timeline, this is what I'm talking about, the funky thing that just happened. Now, because I combined them both into the same symbol, it has to choose a layer to put them on. And it looks like it just automatically put them on the topmost. It put them on the title layer. So now we're back to having a keyframe on the title screen that has our Bodacious Bunnies title. And then the next keyframe has our whole page with both the title and the image. Now this is kind of what I want, but I actually want this page, this movie clip page that we just created, to be on the page's timeline. So what I want to do is I want to take this keyframe here and select just this keyframe and just drag it down one so it ends up on the page's timeline. Now we still have to fix one thing. So I moved that down, but what that did is that kind of cleared our blank keyframe we had on the title. So for right now, on our home page, which has our title and all of our buttons, the buttons are being keyframed away when we get to page one, but that title is still there. So now you can see that they're overwriting each other. We have the title Bodacious Bunnies that's still showing up when we get to to page one. But then we have a page one movie clip that has the image and another copy that we changed to be called Marvin inside of it. Okay, so again, I just combined two elements, a title and an image, into a single movie clip. But because I did that, it kind of combined them both onto this keyframe on the title layer. So I'm dragging this keyframe down to the pages layer. So we still have a blank keyframe on home for pages. And then we see our actual page. And now to fix this, we just need to keyframe our title again right here and delete it again. Okay, so there's actually a one shorter step to doing that. We can always just F6 or create a keyframe, however you hit a keyframe, and then delete will give you that blank keyframe. And that's all we really need to do. But there is such thing as a blank keyframe, which you can add, which kind of saves a step. With the hotkeys, it's F7. You can right-click and choose convert to blank keyframe or insert blank keyframe. And when you see blank keyframe, all that means is it's just setting a keyframe and deleting anything that would have been there, right? So that's kind of a shortcut between just keyframing and then hitting delete manually. You can just create a blank keyframe and that'll do it for you. So this is how I want it to end up. I'll give you a moment to kind of set that up. But initially, we had the title and the image. We selected them both, made a new movie clip out of it, which put them both on the title layer. And now we just dragged that title layer keyframe down to pages. So now our movie clip lives on the pages layer. And then we put another blank keyframe or a keyframe and then delete on title so that disappears again. So what we're left with is we're left with keyframes on the home page for both buttons and title. And then as soon as we get to page 1, we have blank keyframes on button and title, which makes those both disappear across the rest of our pages. And now, along with our locked background on page 1, the only graphics we see is this one movie clip symbol that is on the timeline on the pages layer in this one keyframe. Okay, and that movie clip symbol is holding the image and the title. If I look at my library, I can now see that that movie clip symbol is in here and it has a different icon. It has this little square with like a gear or a sprocket or something in it as a movie clip icon rather than the button icon, which has the little finger pointing over it, over a button. And then there's also a graphic symbol icon, which we don't have in there, that's got 3 different little shapes on it. There's also the image icon, which shows this little landscape with a little sun. Kind of important to be able to eye the different types of symbols to make sure you have the right one. Now, another way to be able to tell, besides just looking in the library, another way to be able to tell the type of symbol is by selecting it and then looking at your properties panel. Okay, so if I go to my home page, I can select this text and look at properties and just see, okay, this is static text and this is the type of object that is. I can select one of my buttons and I can see that, oh, this is a button and it's an instance of button 1 in the library. Okay? I can look at my background. If I were to unlock it and select it, I can see, oh, this is a shape. Okay, so it's just a raw shape versus a text field versus a button symbol. If I were to select a graphic image, it would show me the graphic. And now when I go over to page 1 and I select my movie clip, I can see that it says movie clip. And then there's even a place to put the instance name if we needed to talk to this in code. We don't need to, so we're going to leave that blank for now. So the last thing I want to show you about this movie clip for now is if we double click to go inside of it, okay, you can see that just like going into other symbols, it grays out everything around it. And we can see that both of our title and our image are together on this one layer. But you can see that the timeline changed and the layer changed, that just like graphic symbols, movie clip symbols have the same the same type of timeline. Okay, it's just numbers that we have to add frames to and add keyframes to, and we can build out a timeline in a movie clip symbol just like we could in a graphic symbol, just like we can with just the main timeline that isn't even inside of any symbol. All right, so before we move on, I know that was kind of a cluster, this part, but it's something that I want you to be able to recognize is if you select multiple items on the stage, even across multiple layers, and you create a single symbol out of them, whether it's a graphic, a movie clip, or a button symbol, at that point, they're all going to combine onto the same layer. And sometimes you may want to then take that and move it around to be on the right layer. And I really want you guys to be able to understand the ability that as we create frames on our timeline, and as we create frame labels across the timeline to be able to say, okay, this is where my pages are going to be, I want you to understand how on these different layers, we can create keyframes and we can use blank keyframes or deleted keyframes to kind of make graphics come and go. Okay, so here we're switching between our home page and page 1 just by having these layers being keyframed in the right spots. So now we have our movie clip symbol, all right? Now, what I'm really gonna do is I'm gonna duplicate this movie clip symbol on these other pages so we can like keep the layout and just swap out the image and change the name. In the same way that we duplicated these buttons, you can see that I keep like reusing things as much as we can. But first, I want to make a couple of adjustments to the actual movie clip. Just something simple. Let's go inside of it. Let's go inside of the movie clip. All right, and I want to show you how it's real easy to get your layers back. This may be something that you do in a more complicated way in your own project. Instead of just 2 layers, you may want to combine like 10 layers into a single symbol, into a movie clip or a graphic symbol or something. Probably a movie clip if you're combining that many things. It's like a container. But maybe you have an entire page with a whole bunch of elements that you want to combine into a single movie clip. But then once you get inside of it, oh, all my layers are gone. Well, there's an easy way to get your layers back. You can select everything, and this will work on any timeline. It's just a trick that I use a lot inside of a movie clip once I add some things to it. You select both elements on the stage, and then you right-click and choose Distribute to Layers. And that will automatically create a new layer and even name it for you according to each individual piece. All right, so now that I did that, I now have a Bunny 1 layer and a Marvin layer. And then I have an empty layer 1. Now I'm going to make some changes to these. I'm going to delete the empty layer 1, which is where it started. And then because I know that I'm going to duplicate this to create the other pages, like I talked about before, I know that I don't want to have these named according to the content because the next one's going to be named Bunny 2, and then it's not going to be Marvin anymore. I don't want to have to change these layer names to match the content. So it makes more sense to have the layer names be called the type of content rather than the actual content itself, even though that's the way it kind of creates it for you. So instead of Bunny 1, I'm going to rename this layer Image. And then instead of Marvin, I'm going to rename this layer Name. All right, so we've got Image and Name, which are more generic terms that we can now use as a template, and we can change the image and change the name and not worry about, you know, things not matching up or having to do extra work changing layer names. Okay, so once I've got my layers back by right-clicking and choosing Distribute to Layer, and then I've changed the image or changed the layer names here. Let's go back up to scene 1, or to scene 1, to the main timeline. And now I want to basically create copies of these for each page. So the first step is we're just going to keyframe these on each of the other pages. So I have a single keyframe on page 1. Let's put a keyframe F6 on page 2, on page 3, and on page 4. Okay, so all on the pages timeline. I still have it highlighted by this little pink dot, which is giving it this line across, which is helping me see where it's at here. All right, now I've created copies of each of these, but just like when we did it with the buttons, if I were to just go in, and I still to this day make this mistake, which is why I keep harping on it, is it's really important to remember that if I'm just keyframing to create copies of something, I have to duplicate it first and actually make it a separate library symbol, right? Like right now, these are all copies of the same page 1 movie clip. And if I go inside of the one that's on page 2, and if I start changing this and change it from Marvin to Frodo, and I go back up, now all of them are named Frodo because it changed all of the symbols. Now sometimes that's useful if you're using the same symbol in multiple spots, but what we're doing here, I'm going to go back into this. In fact, I'm going to use Command Z to undo so it goes back to Marvin. It took me out of my context when I did that. So I'm going to go back to scene 1, and now I can see it still says Marvin. But now I just have to remember that I'm using this as a template for another clip, and I need to duplicate it first, okay? So it's the same thing we've done 2 different times now with the buttons, is duplicate the button after we set it all up to create the other buttons, and then change the labels. We're gonna do the same thing here. So now that we've got, and again, we do this so we don't have to do the same thing. We don't have to put it in the same spot. We don't have to align it and nudge it down again. We don't have to get just the right text in the right size in the right spot. We can reuse these elements and then just swap them out much quicker. So I'm gonna select this one now that's on page 2, and just gonna right click and go to Duplicate Symbol. And that will use the original symbol as a template, create a complete copy of it, instead of page 1 copy, I'm going to name it page 2. Now I can see in the library, we've got page 1 and page 2 as 2 separate movie clips. So let's do the same thing with page 3 and page 4 before we start making changes, just to make sure that we have all separate stuff. Okay, so we go to page 3. And again, when I say go to page 3, it means just take your blue little playhead here and put it in the vertical position over your page 3 label. And then right click on the movie clip on the stage, choose duplicate symbol, call this one page 3. Do the same thing on page 4, right click, duplicate symbol, page 4. So we end up with, along with having our 4 bunny asset images in our library, we have our 4 button symbols, and now we have 4 different page symbols, all right? And now that we have 4 different page symbols, we can, now that they're separate symbols and they've been duplicated, now we can go inside of page 2, 3, and 4, and we can change them. So let me show you how easy this is. So inside of page 2 now, we're going to double click to go inside of it. And the first thing is, let's change the name to Frodo. Easy enough, just changing the text. And now the image, instead of clicking, now we could just delete it and then drag the other image and then center it and nudge it down and put it in the right spot. But what's a lot faster, the same thing we did with our bunny images and our buttons, is if we just swap the image. That will keep its, all of its position and rotation and scale and just replace it with a different image. So to do that, I'm going to move from my library panel back over to my properties panel. And if I select the image on stage, I can choose this little icon with the arrows pointing in either direction, left or right, and I can choose swap. And that will just open up, it'll say swap bitmap. That'll open up this dialog box that shows me all of the other bunnies. I'm going to choose bunny 2 here to swap it out. And now this little fluffy fella is now Frodo. And we have this image here and this title. And if we go back up a level to scene 1, I can now drag my playhead in between the Marvin. Now I've got 3 pages set up. I've got my home page, Bodacious Bunnies and my buttons. I've got page 1, Marvin, page 2, Frodo. And now let's move on to page 3. I'll go inside of page 3, and I'm going to swap out the image. Again, I'm going to select the image on the stage, click the swap button, choose bunny 3, which is this fellow in the library. Okay, so this is Muffin in the library. Excellent. All right, easy enough. Change that. We have one more to do. So another thing, what we're getting really used to is continuously going in and out of symbols, right? So I'm inside of the Marvin symbol and I'm using the breadcrumb trail up here, hitting scene 1 or the arrow key to go back out of the symbol and back up to the main timeline. All right, so we're cultivating the ability to not only create some space on the timeline, create different places where these different sections are going to live on the timeline, but then we've got symbols on those different pages, these different sections of the timeline, that we're double clicking in and out of to kind of deal with the content that's on that spot. That's a real common way you guys can set up your own projects, is kind of lay out your main sections across the main timeline within movie clips, and then go inside of them. And then you can control everything on that specific page, whether it's just a few graphics and a button, or you've got a bunch of animations, or whatever it may be. This is a real common way to lay it out. So going inside of page 4 now, so we've got Marvin, Frodo, Muffin, and then let's go inside of page 4 again, and let's swap out this image with Bunny 4. Like that, or maybe IE. All right, we'll do the IE, Flopsy. Okay, perfect. So now what you should have, you change your name to Flopsy. Go back up to scene 1. And now we've got Bodacious Bunnies. I'm going to actually save the file. Command S. And I think this is as far as I want to take it today. We're at a nice stopping point here, having our pages set up. But for right now, you should just be able to take your timeline, take your playhead and drag it from your home page to Marvin, to Frodo, to Muffin, to Flopsy here. And this is going to be the first step before you ever need to program anything or make any buttons work or do anything in your own project. Again, this is the method that you'll use. Is you'll, on the main timeline, you'll create some frames to work with, you'll create a code layer, you'll create some frame labels to determine what different sections or pages or screens you have. And then just through a series of layers and importing your graphics and pulling them in from the library and keyframing and blank keyframing and deleting things and making symbols and combining things, you're going to want to kind of use this method to lay out all of your graphics. You run this in the browser right now, it just plays through and shows us everything, which is fine. Not a big deal. It just shows us that everything's in there and it's looping through the timeline.